40 years ago, on an autumn evening in the city of London, Eleanor Price left her office during rush hour and vanished without trace, leaving her family bewildered and with a question no one could answer. The authorities at the time believed she might have left voluntarily, and with no body, no direct witnesses, the investigation gradually reached a deadlock and was shelved like hundreds of other cases. For decades, Eleanor was merely a name in the archives, a void covered over by time and assumptions. However, when a new investigation team returned to reading every old report, they discovered overlooked inconsistencies and a small detail once deemed unimportant, but which had the potential to overturn the entire understanding of the evening she disappeared. And then, from that very void, a chain of truths began to emerge, leading the case in a direction no one in 1984 had ever considered. Before delving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. City of London, an autumn evening in 1984, when the clocks on the office buildings around Fenchurch Street had just reached finishing time, the flow of people spilled onto the pavements like a familiar wave of the financial city. Dark overcoats, briefcases clutched to chests, hurried footsteps blending into the sound of engines and lights beginning to switch on amid the thin fog. Eleanor Price left the office just as on any other day, neither earlier nor later, carrying no sense of an unusual evening, her hair tied back neatly, her familiar gait seen by colleagues who had watched her glide through the corridor hundreds of times before. There was no argument, no urgent call, no hasty note left on her desk, nor any sign that Eleanor was preparing for a change, and certainly no one thought that would be the last time they saw her. That evening, in the brief interval, when the city was shifting from day rhythm to night rhythm, 3 people later said they had seen Eleanor, but each placed her in a different location, as if the city had fragmented her silhouette into 3 disparate pieces. One was certain they had seen Eleanor turn towards the familiar path, where the crowd usually dispersed towards the nearby stations. The second believed she had paused to speak briefly with someone in the crowd, though they could not clearly recall the other's face. The third insisted they had spotted Eleanor in a position well off her usual route, just a few streets away. No account was entirely like another, and the most frightening thing was not the differences, but the fact that no one could say for sure they were the last to see Eleanor alive. As daylight withdrew from the narrow streets and the office windows gradually darkened, the city began to thin out, but Eleanor did not appear at her lodgings in Whitechapel as usual. At first, that delay caused no alarm, for London is a place where an evening can easily stretch longer than expected, where chance encounters and detours are commonplace. But time passed, and Eleanor's silence began to feel unusual. Her family called her workplace, hoping someone knew where Eleanor had gone after finishing time, but the responses were only shakes of the head and genuine surprise. Further calls were made to acquaintances, to the lodgings where she lived, each ring of the telephone carrying fragile hope that someone would say Eleanor had just left, that she was only late, that everything would be fine. But no one knew where Eleanor was, no one heard her voice that evening, no one could piece together the 3 sightings into a coherent story. As the clock hands approached midnight, anxiety had crossed the threshold of ordinary waiting, and Eleanor's absence was no longer a harmless delay. In the quiet room, where her family sat by the telephone, the decision was made after heavy minutes of hesitation. Eleanor Price had not returned, and no one knew where she was. Near midnight, they picked up the phone to call the police, for the first time voicing aloud what no one had wanted to think all evening, that Eleanor Price was missing. The City of London Police received the missing person report for Eleanor Price in the familiar cautious manner for cases that start late like this, when the clock had passed midnight, and most initial leads existed only as fragmented memories of people just finishing work. 2 duty officers recorded the basic information, asking repeatedly the standard questions about age, occupation, daily habits, recent relationships, and why the family believed this absence was unlike ordinary lateness. There were no signs of violence, no threats, no reported prior conflicts. Eleanor Price was classified as a missing adult, with initial priority, cautious rather than urgent. However, in the early hours of the morning, while the city was not yet fully awake, the first checks were deployed according to procedure, One team to Eleanor's workplace near Fenchurch Street, another to her lodgings in Whitechapel, and one officer tasked with scanning the routes she usually took at the end of the workday. At the office, Eleanor's desk was still tidy as when she left, with no sign of an evening abruptly interrupted, no note left behind, no one recalling seeing her return after finishing time. Colleagues could only confirm that Eleanor had left the building with the crowded flow, blending into the city's familiar rhythm. In Whitechapel, her lodgings were silent. No one had answered the door all night. The landlady confirmed Eleanor had not returned, and no one had collected mail or messages for her. That information was carefully noted, line by line, like the initial pieces of an empty picture. As morning progressed towards noon, police began assembling and standardizing the last seen points, turning last night's accounts into official statements. The first person, a colleague, said they had seen Eleanor leave the building and head in her usual direction. The second, a casual acquaintance met on the street, believed they had seen her pause in the crowd to speak briefly with someone. The third insisted they had seen Eleanor in a position well off the familiar route, at a time approximate to the other two accounts. Each statement sounded reasonable in isolation, but when placed side by side, they began to contradict in ways hard to explain. The officers tried to arrange them into a sequence, stretching time by a few minutes, assuming Eleanor might have changed direction, might have taken a detour, but no arrangement made the 3 points fully align. The differences were not large enough to dismiss any statement, but not small enough to ignore, and that made the initial search hours tense in a quiet way. While some officers continued scanning the area around Fenchurch Street and routes leading east, others phoned hospitals, neighboring police stations, and major stations in the city, seeking any sign that Eleanor had appeared somewhere after finishing time. There were no reports of admitting a matching patient, no information about a woman named Eleanor Price. No one recognized the name when asked. Gradually, the time points were marked in pencil on the tracking board in the small duty room, and the gaps between them became clearer each time a new statement was added. It was a gap not too long, but enough to make every initial assumption fragile, for no one could say for sure what Eleanor had done, or where she had gone, in that interval. The police found themselves facing an incomplete picture, where the lines refused to fit together, and the only thing they could affirm at that point was that Eleanor's absence could not be explained by a single last seen point. The initial search hours passed in forced patience, with reports thickening, but answers still out of reach, and as afternoon fell, the clearest feeling left in their workspace was not certainty, but unease before a disappearance that was slowly moving beyond the framework of ordinary delays. When the initial statements had been fully recorded, and the first search hours yielded no concrete results, police began moving to the phase they believed necessary to bring chaos to temporary order, reconstructing the timeline of the evening Eleanor Price disappeared. On the tracking board in the workspace, time points were written in white chalk, each attached to a name and location, and the officer's task now was not to find absolute truth, but to create a sequence reasonable enough to serve as the basis for every next step. They started with the most certain thing, or at least the least doubted, the moment Eleanor left the building where she worked near Fenchurch Street, confirmed by multiple people at once, matching finishing time and fitting the described habits. From there, the accounts were linked like loose strands, extending from that common starting point. The first statement placed Eleanor on the familiar route, blending into the crowd heading towards stations. The second suggested she had slowed, paused in the crowd to speak briefly with an unidentified person. The third shifted her to a different position, off the usual direction, but still within reasonable walking distance. When the officers tried arranging these three accounts in various ways, they realized there was only one way to temporarily avoid contradiction: choose a central time point, a standard moment, based on the statement that seemed most specific and consistent about timing. It was not a perfect choice, but the least problematic among those available, and it quickly became the pivot for the entire temporary sequence. From that time point, Eleanor was assumed to have moved in a direction that could be explained, with small deviations considered normal in a crowded London evening. In the file, this assumption was clearly noted as an assumption, not a conclusion, but in practice, it began shaping how officers viewed any new information. However, As soon as the first timeline was completed on paper, signs of instability emerged. Between the standard point and the time Eleanor should have appeared in Whitechapel by habit, a time gap appeared that could not be filled by any existing statement. That gap was not long enough to immediately suggest the worst, but not short enough to ignore. The officers tried stretching the points, allowing Eleanor to walk slower, detour through side streets, even pause somewhere briefly, but no matter the adjustment, a period remained where no one could say where she was. Each time they tried inserting a statement to fill that gap, a new contradiction appeared elsewhere, as if any arrangement required distorting another part of the sequence. The choice of the standard time point, made to reduce contradictions, now became the point every question returned to, because if that point was wrong, the entire timeline built around it would waver too. But at that moment, there was not enough reason to discard it, and reconstructing the timeline had to continue on that fragile foundation. In the reports, the time gap was circled and marked unexplained, a neutral phrase but carrying its own weight for investigators. It said nothing about what had happened, but said clearly what was not yet known. The officers recognized that every subsequent search step, from determining direction of movement to expanding the scan area, would be directly influenced by this temporary sequence. A timeline, even temporary, has the power to direct thinking, and when it contains a gap, that gap becomes the center of unease. By the end of the day, when the first timeline was accepted for use in the file, no one in the workspace believed it had told the full story of that evening. It was only a sketch, built from imperfect memories, with a time point chosen for relative reasonableness rather than certainty, and with a time gap quietly lying in the middle, waiting either to be filled or to be proven unfillable by ordinary assumptions. When the first timeline was constructed and entered into the file as a temporary reference framework, police began returning to the witnesses who had provided the initial last scene points, this time, not with casual recording questions, but with structured interviews aimed at testing the stability of their accounts under the pressure of detail and time. Right from the first re-interviews, differences began to emerge clearly. The colleague, who had been certain of seeing Eleanor leave the building and head straight in the familiar direction, when asked to describe precisely his own standing position and the distance between them, hesitated longer than before answering, and the time he stated also shifted by a few minutes from the initial statement. A small change, not enough to be considered a serious contradiction, but enough for the officers to note that the memory was not immutable, as they had thought. The second person, who believed they had seen Eleanor pause in the crowd to speak with someone, initially did not clearly recall the face of the person with her, but in the re-interview added a new detail, that the person seemed slightly taller than Eleanor. When asked why that detail had not been mentioned before, the response was only a shrug, and the explanation that at first he had not thought it important. The third person, who placed Eleanor in a position off the usual route, also adjusted his account, not about the location, but about the sequence, saying that he might have seen Eleanor a few minutes earlier or later than what he had been certain of. Each change was small, each explanation sounded reasonable, but when the officers placed them side by side, the already fragile picture of the timeline began to crack further. The concern was not that the witnesses remembered wrongly, but that none of them remembered in the same way. In the process of cross-referencing reports, one particular detail caught the attention of a young officer tasked with reviewing old notes. In the second person's first statement, there was a sentence lightly underlined in the margin, almost never mentioned in subsequent discussions. It was a passing remark about Eleanor seeming to be looking towards something in the crowd, but since there was no further information, that detail had been assessed as unimportant and quickly overlooked to focus on more specific times and locations. When asked again about that remark, the witness appeared confused, unsure whether he had actually noticed it or was just guessing based on a vague impression. That uncertainty made the small detail even easier to set aside, but at the same time made the officers realize that these very things deemed unimportant could be what changed the entire understanding of that evening. Meanwhile, the temporary timeline, already based on a standard time point chosen for relative reasonableness, now had to bear the additional weight of shifting accounts. Each time a small point was adjusted, the unexplained time gap at the center of the sequence changed shape, sometimes shrinking, sometimes expanding, but never disappearing. The officers tried updating the timeline by incorporating the new versions of statements, clearly marking the changed points, but instead of creating a clearer sequence, they ended up with multiple parallel versions, each potentially correct in its own way, and each leading to different questions. The fragility of the timeline was not only in the time points, but in the foundational assumption that the witnesses had seen the same chain of events. As the accounts changed, even minimally, that assumption began to waver. It was possible that Eleanor had not followed a simple sequence from point A to point B, as the first timeline suggested, and it was also possible that one or more witnesses had inadvertently merged memories of that evening with similar other evenings, creating false certainty. For the police, this was a familiar, uncomfortable situation. They needed a sequence to act, but the only sequence they had was not solid enough for absolute trust. In the short meetings held at the end of the day, questions were raised more than answers. Was the standard time point really reliable? Was the detail overlooked as unimportant, hiding something larger? And most importantly, was that time gap the result of imperfect memories, or a sign of an event that none of the witnesses had recognized or were willing to admit? As the reports were rearranged in the file, the first timeline, created to bring order, now appeared as a fragile structure, capable of changing with just a revised statement or an additionally remembered detail. Instead of clarifying the evening Eleanor disappeared, the process of re-interviewing witnesses had made the picture more complicated, and the feeling spreading through the investigation team at this point was not of approaching the truth, but of standing before a story, gradually slipping away from the simple frameworks they had hoped to impose on it. As the statements began to shift, and the temporary timeline became more fragile, rather than clearer, the investigation team was forced to return to the most fundamental question in every adult missing person case: whether Eleanor Price had left voluntarily or not. In the context of the initial hours after the report passing without signs of violence, no witnesses hearing cries for help, no reports of a public incident, this assumption was not an easy choice, but a standard line of thinking. Eleanor was an adult, with a stable job, no recorded history of threats or stalking, and someone departing from routine on an evening in London was not rare. On paper, the voluntary departure assumption allowed police to partly explain the time gap in the timeline without resorting to a criminal event, lacking evidence. It also fitted with how the conflicting last seen points were being interpreted. If Eleanor had actively changed her direction or plans, the witnesses seeing her in different positions within the same time frame became more acceptable. In internal discussions, this assumption was mentioned as a possibility to consider seriously, not because anyone firmly believed Eleanor had walked away, but because at that point, nothing was strong enough to refute it. In the first 24 hours, basic checks showed no clear signs of crime, the lodgings were undisturbed, the workplace recorded no conflicts, nearby hospitals and police stations had no relevant information. These factors, added together, created a neutral picture, where Eleanor's absence could be explained by an unclear personal decision. However, accepting this assumption, even temporarily, began influencing how the file was handled. The case priority was not elevated, as in instances with clear danger signs, and resources were allocated toward scanning rather than urgent pursuit. Officers continued recording information, but the initial urgency gradually gave way to a cautious pace, where each step awaited further confirming data. In the reports, the voluntary departure assumption was not written as a conclusion, but it was present in how questions were framed and in what was considered priority. Details not fitting this assumption, such as Eleanor not contacting anyone after finishing time, were noted but not yet placed at the center of analysis. The time gap in the timeline, instead of being seen as a warning sign, was temporarily viewed as a space where Eleanor could have moved freely without leaving traces. This choice gave the investigation team a sense of temporary order, but also created a lens through which all new information would be viewed. When an assumption is placed on the table, even for testing, it tends to shape what is noticed and what is set aside. The officers understood that, but they also knew investigation could not proceed in a completely directionless state. This initial assumption became the anchor, helping them continue work while awaiting a lead strong enough to force a change in direction. However, even internally, there were whispered concerns, because not every factor easily aligned with the assumption that Eleanor had left voluntarily. Some officers pointed out that completely disappearing from all familiar contacts for over a day was rare, especially without signs of prior preparation. These opinions were noted, but lacked the weight to overturn the applied approach. In the context of lacking direct evidence, the decision to continue handling the case as non-criminal in the early phase was seen as reasonable, even necessary to avoid hasty steps. Yet this very decision, though made with caution and based on what was observable, silently laid the foundation for the entire subsequent process. It influenced speed, scope, and manner of information gathering, and more importantly, it shaped expectations about what the investigation team thought they were searching for. As time continued passing without signs of Eleanor reappearing, the initial assumption retained its position in the file, not as a firm conclusion, but as the implicit context for every subsequent decision. And while that assumption helped explain the absence of criminal evidence in the first 24 hours, it also simultaneously blurred the sense of urgency that an unexplained time gap should have created, leaving a quiet question mark about whether the direction chosen from the start was bringing the search closer to the truth, or inadvertently pulling it further away. When the initial assumption that Eleanor Price might have left voluntarily was retained as a temporary reference framework, the search scope was expanded according to the logic of that assumption, but precisely because of that, it began to deviate from what had actually happened. Officers were assigned to scan points where a person might appear if they actively departed from usual routine: major stations in central London, hospitals admitting unidentified people, and crowded areas where an individual could blend into the crowd without leaving many traces. Liverpool Street, Cannon Street, London Bridge, and suburban train lines became names repeated in reports, with standard question lists sent to each information desk and duty office. Night trains were scanned, passenger records checked where possible, and successive calls made to ask if anyone remembered seeing a woman named Eleanor Price that evening. In parallel, hospitals in the central and east London area were contacted, not only to search for admissions under Eleanor's name, but also to check for anyone admitted with memory loss or without papers matching her description. All these efforts were carefully documented, forming a dense chain of activity on paper, but the actual results were worryingly sparse. No reports confirmed Eleanor had bought a ticket or boarded a train leaving London that evening. No hospital recorded a matching admission, and no staff at major transit points remembered interacting with her. Each time a search direction was closed without results, the assumption that Eleanor had left voluntarily was neither refuted nor strengthened by any specific evidence. In short end-of-day meetings, officers began realizing they were pursuing traces fitting a theoretically reasonable scenario, but with no real signs that scenario had occurred. However, the lack of evidence did not immediately lead to changing the approach. Instead, it prompted the investigation team to continue expanding scope along the same logic, hoping that somewhere in the city, a small piece of information would appear to confirm Eleanor had departed from her familiar life rhythm. In this process, some initial information began to be ranked as secondary, details not fitting the voluntary departure assumption, or not leading to a specific search direction in crowded areas, were noted but not pursued thoroughly. A call reporting a possible sighting of a woman resembling Eleanor in an area outside the main search route was marked unconfirmed, and no officer was sent to check immediately. Another vague statement lacking precise timing was set aside for insufficient reliability to prioritize at this stage. Those decisions did not stem from indifference, but from the pressure to allocate resources reasonably in a vast city, where each direction consumed time and manpower. But this very allocation, guided by the initial assumption, gradually created a gap between what was being searched for and what might actually be important. When no traces confirmed Eleanor had left London, the question that should have been asked was whether the search direction needed changing, but instead of facing that question directly, the file continued being updated with no findings entries from one station to another hospital. On paper, The search appeared comprehensive, with long lists of checked locations and made calls, but in reality, it resembled a closed circle, turning around a never-verified assumption. Some officers began sensing this misalignment, but their concerns were hard to turn into action without specific evidence to justify shifting direction. The more time passed without results, the harder it became to revisit overlooked details, because each passing day reinforced the feeling that if something serious had happened, its signs would have appeared by now. By the end of this expanded search phase, the clearest thing in the file was not a lead to Eleanor, but the long list of places she had not appeared. There were no traces confirming she had left London, but also no evidence forcing the investigation team to admit they were searching in the wrong place. Some initial information, if pursued more deeply from the start, might have led to different questions, but at that point, they remained dormant in the reports, covered by the volume of work directed towards seemingly more reasonable search directions. And while the city continued operating at its unchanging pace, the search for Eleanor Price, though expanded on the map, was gradually narrowing in thinking, held tightly within a framework that itself had never been proven correct. As the search scope had been expanded towards stations, hospitals, and central areas, yet still yielded no traces confirming that Eleanor Price had left London, the file began to swell in a different way, not with new discoveries, but with details pushed to the margins, because they did not fit the handling direction being applied. Among them, the most prominent was a statement from the very first days, once recorded but quickly assessed as unreliable. The person giving that statement was not a close colleague, or a witness with a clear position in the timeline, but an individual who happened to be near the Fenchurch Street area that evening, did not remember the exact time, and whose description of Eleanor did not fully match what had been recorded from other sources. That vagueness caused the statement to be placed in the secondary information group, kept in the file but not incorporated into the timeline construction or search direction. In internal discussions, it was often mentioned only as an example of the inaccurate memories that every missing person case in a large city encounters. Parallel to some statements being downgraded in value, an important time point in the file was also recorded incorrectly in a more subtle way. In the process of compiling initial reports, an officer had transferred a time from a handwritten statement to the official typed version, and in that operation, a figure was shifted by a few minutes from the original. This discrepancy was not large enough to draw immediate attention, and since it did not directly contradict the assumption being used, no one questioned it or requested a recheck. The incorrect time point was quickly copied into subsequent documents, becoming part of the temporary timeline, without carrying any warning signs. As officers continued working based on this sequence, other small adjustments also began to appear, each time deemed insignificant: a statement rounded to the nearest hour for ease of tracking, a time period assumed flexible to avoid contradictions, a location detail described more generally to fit easily on the map. No deviation was large enough to force a halt and re-examination of the entire sequence from the beginning, but each change shifted the timeline a little from what had actually occurred. Those small deviations, when standing alone, did not create a sense of danger. They seemed like necessary adjustments to turn a collection of imperfect memories into a workable story. The problem was that no one in the investigation team could see the full picture of these adjustments as they occurred over time, because each decision was made in the context of the present moment, with the aim of keeping the file progressing. The statement assessed as unreliable was not cross-referenced again with other information, the incorrect time point was not compared to the original, and the details gradually blurred lost their ability to raise doubts. As the file was updated and passed through the hands of different officers in the following days, those deviations did not disappear. On the contrary, they accumulated layered upon each other, and formed a foundation increasingly distant from what the witnesses had actually said on the evening Eleanor disappeared. This did not happen due to carelessness, but because of how an investigation is organized under conditions of lacking clear evidence to move forward. One is forced to simplify, and in that process, what does not fit the main direction is gradually pushed to the edges. Some officers, when reviewing the file again to prepare for next steps, began noticing slight inconsistencies between document versions, but these differences were explained by witnesses' memories changing over time, or by unavoidable recording errors in the busy initial phase. No one had strong enough motivation to stop and ask whether those very overlooked details might be hiding something more important. In the context of no new discoveries from the expanded search, the pressure to prove that every reasonable direction had been pursued made the investigation team cling tighter to what had been accepted in the file, rather than returning to re-examine undervalued information. Thus, small deviations were added one by one, not to distort the truth intentionally, but to make the story smoother on paper. By that point, no one could say that a specific detail had derailed the investigation, but looking at the file thickening day by day, it was clear that the truth, if it lay in those marginalized details, was increasingly being obscured by the very process designed to uncover it. As days passed without any sign of contact from Eleanor Price, the hypothesis that she had voluntarily disappeared began to show cracks difficult to ignore, though on paper it had not yet been discarded. Officers reviewed the days before the evening she went missing, searching for any sign that Eleanor had prepared to leave her familiar life, but found nothing fitting a deliberate decision. There was no letter left behind, no ambiguous message sent to friends or family, no sudden change in daily habits or work recorded. The fact that Eleanor was completely silent, not calling, not writing, not leaving any sign that she was somewhere, and deliberately avoiding contact, gradually became hard to explain if her absence was viewed as a voluntary choice. In other adult missing person cases, even when the individual wanted to cut ties with the past, there were often small traces indicating preparation, an unusual purchase, an indirect conversation, or at least a transitional period that relatives could sense. With Eleanor, those traces were entirely absent. Reports continued to be updated with the repeated note that there was no new contact information, and that repetition, over time, began to carry its own meaning. Some officers questioned whether this prolonged silence truly fitted the initial assumption, because even in cases where the missing person actively left, absolute silence for such a long period was rare, especially without prior preparation signs. However, raising questions did not mean changing how the file was handled. There was no direct evidence that Eleanor was in danger, and the timeline discrepancies, though concerning, could still be explained by witness memory inaccuracies. Officers were aware of the growing contradiction between the voluntary disappearance hypothesis and what they observed, but under conditions lacking physical clues, or a specific event identifiable as criminal, upgrading the file's severity remained delayed. The file continued to reside in a gray area, not fully fitting a voluntary missing case, but not yet with enough grounds to be treated as a criminal one. This hesitation was evident in how resources were allocated, active search steps gradually reduced, while information recording and storage continued at a steady but less urgent pace. Details pushed to the margins in the previous phase were not pulled back for re-examination in the light of the prolonged silence, and the incorrectly recorded time point remained undisturbed in the timeline without challenge. The absence of prior preparation signs, instead of becoming the factor that completely collapsed the voluntary disappearance hypothesis, was cautiously explained as Eleanor possibly acting impulsively, or that preparation signs simply had not been discovered. This explanation helped maintain the file's current status, where all possibilities remained theoretically open, but none strong enough to force a change in approach. Over time, Eleanor's silence became a familiar part of the file, recorded regularly, but no longer creating the urgency felt in the early days. For the family and those closely following the case, that silence carried a frightening meaning, but within the official handling framework, it was gradually normalized as a characteristic of prolonged missing cases without evidence. Officers understood that each passing day reduced the chances of finding new traces, but they were also bound by the requirement to base upgrades on specific evidence. The cracking of the voluntary disappearance hypothesis thus occurred slowly and quietly, not by a shocking discovery, but by the accumulation of things that did not happen. No call, no letter, no sign of a plan executed. Yet when the file was reviewed at this point, it had not yet crossed the threshold to be considered a case requiring urgent criminal intervention. The initial hypothesis, though increasingly hard to defend, still served as an administrative anchor, allowing the case to continue being handled in a waiting state, where the severity of an unprovable possibility was not yet enough to alter the trajectory the investigation had followed from the early days. As the voluntary disappearance hypothesis, no longer held as firmly as in the early days, but had not yet been discarded, Eleanor Price's missing person case gradually entered the most dangerous phase for any investigation, the phase where nothing new happens. The search steps once continuously deployed in the initial weeks began to slow in a barely noticeable way, not by a sudden decision, but by a gradual decline in pace and attention. Periodic scanning calls to hospitals and stations were spaced out, from daily to weekly, then thinning further as they continually received the familiar responses of no new information. Central areas once checked multiple times were no longer prioritized, as returning without specific leads was seen as pointless repetition. In internal reports, the language also began to change, from action-oriented phrases like "currently searching" to more neutral notes, reflecting the reality that there were no clear directions left to pursue. Leads once hoped to open new paths, when examined more closely, were all insufficiently strong to pull the investigation back to an urgent state. The statement assessed as unreliable remained dormant in the file, not reinforced by any other information. The incorrectly recorded time point, though starting to bother some officers when reviewing documents, was not corrected because there was no clear basis to determine which version was accurate. Details pushed to the margins in the previous phase continued there, like puzzle pieces without a place in the overall picture. Each time a new officer was assigned to review the file, he faced the same issue. There were many papers, many notes, but no solid anchor to restart from scratch in a different way. In that context, maintaining a high search level became hard to justify in terms of resources, especially without evidence that Eleanor was in immediate danger. The file began to be handled in the rhythm of other prolonged cases, with periodic updates more procedural than substantive investigation. Meetings about the case became rarer, and when they occurred, most time was spent confirming no significant new information since the last update. This did not mean the missing person case was completely forgotten, but it showed a clear shift from active pursuit to passive waiting. In storage systems, Eleanor's file was placed in the Unsolved Cases group, with classification labels accurately reflecting the reality at that time: insufficient evidence to treat as criminal, insufficient signs to continue expanded searching. This reshelving was administrative, but its impact went beyond paperwork. Once a case is placed in that state, any new information, if it appears, must cross a higher attention threshold to be deemed important enough to reactivate active investigation. In the following months, occasional calls or scattered information were still sent in, but nothing specific enough to break the silence enveloping the file. Each new lead was recorded, but also quickly assessed as insufficiently strong to change the situation. The repetition of this process created a sense of weariness, not only for Eleanor's relatives, but also for officers who had worked directly on the case. They understood that lack of results was not always a sign of failure, but were clearly aware that time was eroding the chances of finding answers. Witnesses' memories, already unstable from the start, became even fainter with each passing month, and small details not pursued to the end increasingly lost their chance of clarification. When the file was officially shelved in the list of unsolved missing persons, it was not announced as a turning point, but occurred quietly, almost invisibly to the outside world. There was no closure announcement, no statement that the investigation had stopped, only a subtle change in how the case was handled and prioritized. Eleanor Price was not found, but was also no longer searched for with the same urgency as before. Her missing person case entered the state that many similar files had fallen into, where it existed as a thick document on the archive shelf, ready to be reopened if something new emerged. But in the meantime, it lay dormant, covered by the dust of time and uncertainty. In that state, no one could say the investigation had ended, but neither could anyone affirm it was still continuing in an active sense. The file cooled gradually, not because of a decisive choice, but because of the absence of leads strong enough to keep it alive, and that very absence repeating over time, had moved Eleanor Price's missing person case out of the center of attention, placing it in a quiet corner of the system, where it awaited anything, sufficient to force the already closed door to open once more. As the missing person file for Eleanor Price gradually cooled and was shelved according to standard administrative procedure, what the 1984 investigation had achieved was recorded quite fully, but what it had not done lay scattered in the gaps between reports that seemed complete. Only when reviewing the entire process with the distance of time did those gaps become clearly visible, not as deliberate mistakes, but as consequences of decisions considered reasonable at the time. One of the most noticeable points was that key statements were never systematically cross-referenced. From the very first days, each witness was interviewed separately, their accounts carefully recorded, but rarely placed alongside others to check compatibility at the detail level. Small contradictions in time and location were explained as natural memory errors, rather than becoming subjects of independent analysis. When the temporary timeline was constructed based on a standard time point, statements not fully fitting that point were adjusted or blurred, rather than used to challenge the foundational assumption. This lack of cross-referencing helped the investigation progress more smoothly on paper, but also eliminated opportunities to detect anomalies that might have led to a different direction. Additionally, some important information was not preserved in the way now considered necessary. Initial notes, hastily written in the hours after the report, were not always kept in original form, and when transferred to more official documents, some small details were omitted as deemed irrelevant. Interviews were not always fully recorded, and in some cases, only the officer's summary of spoken words was entered into the file. This caused no immediate issue, as at the time, no one anticipated that those seemingly trivial details would become important years later. However, not fully preserving this information left the file without the ability to self-verify later, when initial participants could no longer be questioned with the same accuracy. Decisions made in the 1984 context were largely based on what was seen as reasonable and efficient then. With no clear signs of crime, prioritizing search directions fitting the assumption that Eleanor left voluntarily was viewed as rational resource use in a large city with countless cases to handle. Not immediately upgrading the file's severity helped avoid unnecessary alarm, and simplifying the timeline gave officers a concrete working tool rather than being stuck in endless possibilities. From the perspective of that time, these decisions all had their reasons, and no one on the investigation team believed they were overlooking anything critical. However, that very reasonableness created an inertia hard to break. Once an approach was accepted and running smoothly, stopping to re-examine its entire foundation became increasingly difficult, especially without new evidence forcing it. Small contradictions in statements were not seen as serious enough to reverse direction, and incomplete preservation of initial information was not considered a problem until too late to remedy. As the file cooled and was shelved, these shortcomings were not mentioned as mistakes, but simply not mentioned. They lay hidden in the file's structure, only detectable if someone took the time to reread every page with a different question in mind, rather than seeking confirmation of what had been accepted. The 1984 investigation, viewed from inside, was a series of actions carried out according to the standards and understanding of that time, but viewed from outside, it clearly showed the limits of a system forced to make decisions under conditions of incomplete information and time pressure. What was not done did not stem from neglect, but from no one foreseeing that those details deemed secondary and assumptions considered reasonable would over time become the file's biggest blind spots. As Eleanor Price's missing person case entered a dormant state, the 1984 decisions were framed as correct choices in their context, but also posed a quiet question no one could answer then: whether the reasonableness of the present was inadvertently obscuring the truth of the future. When the final search steps of 1984 concluded, without any discovery strong enough to change direction, Eleanor Price's missing person file was transferred to cold case status according to procedure. There was no specific moment marking that transition, no solemn concluding meeting, or official announcement that the investigation had stopped. It happened quietly, through familiar administrative actions, as the document folders were reorganized, numbered, labeled, and placed in storage with hundreds of other unsolved files. The names on the folder covers were no longer mentioned in daily meetings, and Eleanor Price, from a recently missing person, became an entry in the list of cases, with no progress. Related items collected in the early phase, though few, were packaged and stored per regulation. They were not treated as criminal evidence in the strict sense, as the case had never been upgraded to a criminal investigation, but were not completely discarded. Each item was briefly noted with origin and collection time, then placed on metal shelves in the warehouse, where they would remain until reason to re-examine arose. This storage accurately reflected the case's status at the time, insufficient data for active pursuit, but unable to close completely. In recording systems, Eleanor's file was marked for reopening if new information appeared, but with no sign that was imminent. Time passed, and with it came changes in how the disappearance was perceived. Officers who had directly worked on the file gradually transferred, retired, or took other roles, carrying their memories of the case away from current investigation scope. Those taking over later saw Eleanor Price only through the pages, through reports and notes written in a long-past context. For them, it was a disappearance without resolution, lacking clear factors to distinguish it from many similar files. With no new event prompting re-examination, each passing year increased the distance between present and that autumn evening in 1984. The silence enveloping the case was not the result of a decision to give up, but the natural consequence of nothing happening. No confession call, no unexpected discovery, no external information forcing the system to respond. The file lay dormant in storage, preserved as part of institutional memory, but untouched in daily reality. Details once debated in the early phase, like conflicting last seen points or the unexplained time gap, were no longer discussed, as there was no forum for it. Without motivation to reopen the file, unanswered questions also sank into dormancy. The shift from an active case to a cold case also brought changes in how it existed in the minds of those involved. Rather than an urgent question needing resolution, Eleanor's disappearance became an unknown possibility, something mentionable when discussing old files, but rarely prioritized. In that context, the silence was not dramatic, but erosive, gradually fading the sense of incompleteness. Each year without new developments made returning harder, as any effort would start by overcoming the dust of time and pre-framed assumptions. For the system, storing the file was the only way to keep resolution possible in theory, though no evidence suggested it would soon become reality. Eleanor Price's missing person case thus officially fell into silence, not because the truth was found, but because there was no clear path to continue searching within known parameters. That silence was not a full stop, but a prolonged pause, where every question hung suspended, awaiting something from the future strong enough to break the fragile balance between not knowing and being unable to do more. More than 3 decades after the evening Eleanor Price disappeared, her file was pulled from silence by a systemic decision rather than a phone call or chance discovery. The Metropolitan Police Cold Case Team, in reviewing long-term disappearances from the 1980s, took on the file as part of a broad reassessment to identify cases potentially benefiting from modern re-examination. There was no declaration of special potential, it simply met administrative criteria: the missing person unfound, no final legal conclusion, and file complete enough for re-reading. The takeover happened quietly, but unlike previous formal reviews, this came with a clear requirement: reread the entire file from scratch, without relying on accepted conclusions, and without assuming what was reasonable in 1984 remained suitable. The document folders were brought from storage, placed on cold case investigators' desks, and turned page by page at a deliberate, intentional pace. Interview reports, handwritten notes, typed versions, timeline diagrams, and internal reports were read as pieces of an unfinished story, this time not to confirm old hypotheses, but to seek mismatches previously overlooked or deemed unimportant. From the very first hours, differences between current file reading and past handling began to emerge. Investigators did not seek a new lead immediately, but focused on internal cross-referencing of the file itself, placing statements side by side in a way the original investigation never did. When last seen points were relisted and compared detail by detail, small contradictions once explained as memory errors now stood out clearer. Not just minute differences, but in sequence and context, factors that, if questioned timely, might have led to different assumptions. One investigator noted that in a witness's initial statement, a detail about Eleanor's direction of movement was never incorporated into the official timeline, though it directly contradicted the chosen standard time point. This detail had been lightly underlined in the margin and never mentioned again, but on rereading, it posed a simple question never pursued. If that direction was correct, Eleanor could not have been in the position the temporary timeline assumed at the same time. In another report, a time point was recorded twice with different figures, one in handwriting, one in typed, and this difference was never explained in the file. In the past, that few-minute discrepancy drew no attention, but in the context of the unexplained central time gap, it became far more significant. The cold case investigators continued reading, and with each page, the familiar sense of a fully known file gave way to realization that much had been accepted without full verification. Another point quickly drew attention: how the voluntary disappearance assumption had permeated the file as implicit context, though never officially recorded as conclusion. In reports, it appeared not as statements, but in prioritized choices and search directions pursued or ignored. Rereading with modern eyes, investigators realized many details not fitting that assumption were undervalued from the start, not for lacking intrinsic value, but for not aligning with the applied direction. A statement once deemed unreliable for vague timing, when placed beside others, became the only one not trying to conform to the standard point, and thus might have reflected reality better than adjusted accounts fitting the timeline. This rereading did not yield clear truth immediately, but created an important shift in case understanding. Rather than a vague event sequence leading to Eleanor's unexplained absence, the file began appearing as overlapping assumptions, where core contradictions had been covered by the need for temporary order. Cold case investigators carefully noted each mismatch, overlooked detail, and administrative decision, potentially influencing direction. They did not rush to conclude mistakes, but nor accept past actions as inviolable. By the end of the initial rereading phase, one thing became clear: Eleanor Price's file lacked not information, but the necessary cross-referencing and questioning to turn information into understanding. Contradictions once secondary were now central, not as evidence of a specific scenario, but as signs the original story was built on shaky foundation. Reopening the file thus ceased being procedural, becoming a true turning point, where for the first time in years, Eleanor's disappearance was viewed not through the lens of reasonable then decisions, but through the simple yet challenging question: if these contradictions existed from the start, why were they never pursued to the end? Systematic rereading of the file did not yield a sensational discovery immediately, but it created the conditions for a pivotal moment. An old detail, once existing quietly in the pages, was for the first time placed in a different context. In the process of cross-referencing statements about the evening Eleanor Price disappeared, an investigator realized that there was a short period, lying between two main last-seen points, where no statement was considered reliable, but there was a scattered note once pushed to the margins. That note mentioned Eleanor being seen pausing in the crowd, as if waiting or searching for something, before turning off her familiar route. Previously, this detail was deemed vague and incompatible with the chosen timeline, but when the old assumption was no longer treated as an inviolable foundation, it began to take on a different meaning. Rather than an uncertain memory, it suggested that Eleanor might have stopped for a specific reason, an action unexplained in prior hypotheses. When this detail was placed alongside other contradictions already uncovered in the file, it became a new anchor for questioning what had truly happened in the central time gap of that evening. This shift in perspective led investigators to re-examine related items stored for years without serious consideration. In storage, there was an item sealed and simply labeled, collected from Eleanor's lodgings in the early days after her disappearance. At the time, It was not treated as criminal evidence, merely one of the few personal belongings retained in case of future comparison. Now that item was brought into the light, not because it was new, but because the questions posed were different. Investigators examined it no longer through the lens of a voluntary disappearance, but as a potential piece of an event not properly understood. The reanalysis proceeded carefully. Every small detail recorded, not to prove a pre-existing hypothesis, but to see if the item could tell a different story from the one it had once been forced to fit. In this process, investigators realized that the way the item was initially recorded clearly reflected the 1984 assumption. It was described briefly, without deep analysis, and quickly placed in the not directly relevant category. But when set in the context of timeline contradictions and the detail of Eleanor pausing in the crowd, the item began to suggest new possibilities. It raised questions about where Eleanor had been in the unexplained time period, and whether she had carried or come into contact with something inconsistent with the hypothesis that she left voluntarily. There was no immediate conclusion, but the first serious attention given to this item marked an important shift in investigative thinking. The direction began to change not with a sharp turn, but with a gradual adjustment of priorities. Rather than continuing to view the case as a series of open possibilities without focus, the cold case team started concentrating on reconstructing the evening Eleanor disappeared based on details once considered exceptions. The central time gap was no longer seen as a blurred area explainable by Eleanor's free movement, but became the center of attention. Investigators asked what that gap might represent if Eleanor had not disappeared voluntarily, an unrecorded meeting, an event causing her to change direction, or a situation no witness correctly understood at the time. The change in investigative direction also involved re-evaluating how previously undervalued statements were used. The statement once deemed unreliable was brought back to the table, this time not to confirm its accuracy or inaccuracy, but to see how it fitted with newly identified contradictions. When placed alongside the detail of Eleanor pausing in the crowd and the re-examined item, a different picture began to form, not complete but distinct enough to force investigators to acknowledge that the old direction might have missed something important. This was not the moment that answered every question, but the moment when the false certainty of the old file was completely shattered. Decisions reasonable at the time were now seen as choices that had shaped the story in a particular way, and dismantling that story required accepting that some foundational assumptions might have been wrong. The new investigative direction was not widely announced, with no statement that the case had turned to a criminal scenario, but internally, the focus had clearly shifted. The goal was no longer to confirm whether Eleanor had left voluntarily, but to determine what had happened in the time period the old file could not explain. Placing an old detail in a new context, and seriously examining a once overlooked related item, had opened a path that previously did not exist on the investigative map. That path had not yet led to answers, but it led to something equally important, the acknowledgement that Eleanor Price's disappearance might have been misunderstood from the very beginning, and that the truth, if still findable after so many years, would not lie in familiar assumptions, but in the very details overlooked, because they did not fit the story accepted when everything was just starting. As the investigative direction had shifted, and details once overlooked were placed back at the center of the file, the cold case team reached a pivotal decision: set aside the entire old timeline and reconstruct the day Eleanor Price disappeared from scratch, as if no sequence had ever been accepted before. This was not editing or supplementing, but a deliberate dismantling process, where every foundational assumption from 1984 was placed on the table and re-examined in turn, not based on familiarity, but on its ability to withstand the discovered contradictions. Investigators began by separating all statements, returning them to their most original state possible, prioritizing initial handwritten records and wording not smoothed in later typed versions. Each account was placed on an independent timeline, without forcing alignment to any standard point. In doing so, one thing became clear: the old timeline was not the result of natural convergence among statements, but the product of selecting a seemingly most reasonable time point and forcing other details to revolve around it. Removing this point immediately altered the shape of that day. Statements once considered out of phase were no longer exceptions, but parallel versions of the same period, reflecting the true chaos of rush hour in the city of London. In this new context, the detail of Eleanor pausing in the crowd was no longer a vague memory, but an anchor point, as it appeared in multiple accounts in varying forms, though previously no one recognized that overlap. One witness said she paused, another said she slowed down, and a third said she did not continue immediately, but all alluded to the same behavior. Eleanor had not left the area in the straightforward manner the old timeline assumed. When investigators placed these descriptions side by side, they realized that action might have lasted longer than a few seconds, enough to create a real gap in her movement. At the same time, old assumptions began to be systematically discarded. The assumption that Eleanor always followed her familiar route was no longer accepted, as there was no evidence beyond habit to prove it on that day. The assumption that her silence could be explained by voluntary disappearance was also pushed from the center, because when reconstructing that day without relying on this assumption, the silence became more anomalous than reasonable. Instead, the investigation team began asking different questions. Why might Eleanor have stopped? Was she waiting for someone, or stopped by someone? And if an event occurred in that period, why was it not identified as a breaking point in the original investigation? Reconstructing the timeline from scratch also allowed investigators to correct accumulated errors over the years. Incorrectly recorded time points were returned to both versions, and rather than choosing one single correct figure, they accepted that uncertainty as part of the issue needing explanation. When time points were plotted on the map as time bands rather than fixed points, a new phenomenon emerged. Between overlapping witness time bands, there was a distinct gap where no direct statement placed Eleanor in a specific position. This gap was not large in minutes, but long enough to be unignorable, without assumptions covering it. This was the window of opportunity for a crime, a concept never identified in the 1984 investigation, because the old timeline had inadvertently erased it. In this window, Eleanor was not reliably seen, but there was also no evidence she had left the area. The existence of this gap changed the entire understanding of that day, as it showed Eleanor's absence was not a prolonged unclear process, but might stem from a specific moment, obscured by crowd chaos and subsequent flawed assumptions. When the crime window was identified, investigators returned to the related item seriously examined for the first time earlier, placing it precisely in this gap rather than vaguely across the entire evening. This new placement created questions the old file had never allowed. Could the item have left Eleanor's control in this time window? And if so, what did that say about the situation she faced? Reconstructing the day Eleanor disappeared from scratch did not yield an immediate answer, but it yielded something more important, a new structure for the unknown. Rather than a blurred story stretching across the evening, there was now a specific time segment needing explanation, and every new investigative direction had to pass through it. Old assumptions, once helping the file survive over the years, were now discarded, not because they were obviously wrong, but because they were no longer necessary to explain what had been established. When the cold case team completed the first draft of the new timeline, the feeling in the workspace was not excitement over an impending solution, but the weight of belated realization. If this time window had been seen in 1984, the investigation might have taken a completely different path. But rather than dwelling on regret, investigators focused on the only thing still possible now, using this new structure to guide every next step, in the hope that though late, correctly seeing the moment everything might have changed direction, was still enough to bring Eleanor Price's disappearance out of the decades-long darkness. As the crime window had been clearly identified in the new reconstruction, the cold case team began reviewing the file backwards with a completely different goal from previous scans, not to find general leads, but to see who in that specific period had the opportunity to approach Eleanor Price. The changed questioning immediately highlighted a name that had appeared in old file pages, but was never pursued thoroughly. That name was not new or unfamiliar, but previously always on the story's edge, mentioned briefly then set aside, because it did not fit the assumption that Eleanor might have left voluntarily. In the new context, that name was reread with entirely different attention. An investigator realized this person had been in the Fenchurch Street area on the exact evening Eleanor disappeared, not as a chance witness, but with a clear reason to be there. In the 1984 file, this information was recorded superficially and not cross-referenced with other time points, as at the time, someone being in the central area during rush hour was not considered suspicious. Now with the crime window delineated, that presence was no longer a neutral detail. It became a specific access opportunity, fitting neatly within the period Eleanor was not reliably seen. The cold case team began reconstructing this person's movements that day, using the very old reports previously only skimmed. Notes about timings, once deemed insufficiently accurate for use, were now placed against the new timeline, and for the first time, they began aligning in a troubling way. The person was not only in the area, but had an unexplained time period overlapping the crime window. In the old file, that gap was covered by a seemingly reasonable alibi, an explanation accepted without strong challenge, as in 1984 there was no clear reason to doubt. That alibi, reread under the new structure's light, began showing weaknesses. It relied heavily on the provider's own memory, and indirect confirmations from people unable to provide precise timings. In the original context, this vagueness was deemed sufficient, but in a cold case investigation, where every minute mattered, that vagueness became an issue. Investigators did not rush to conclude the alibi was false, but noted it was no longer as solid as before. Another detail also began emerging as the name was recent read, the person's connection to details once marginalized. The statement previously deemed unreliable, when reread, mentioned someone with characteristics matching this suspect's description, standing near Eleanor in the crowd. That detail was once ignored for lack of confirmation, but now, with a specific name for comparison, it no longer existed in a vacuum. It became a piece potentially fitting the new picture, not enough to charge, but enough to shake the safety this name had enjoyed in the old file. The cold case team continued digging deeper, not only into the evening Eleanor disappeared, but into how this name had been handled in the original investigation. They realized the person was never interviewed as a potential suspect. Every question posed was confirmatory, aimed at quickly excluding involvement to return to the voluntary departure assumption. There was no cross-referencing between this person's statement and other witnesses, no effort to question unclear timings, as at the time it was deemed unnecessary. In the current context, those decisions were no longer neutral. They created a gap in the file, where a clear access opportunity existed, but was not properly checked. As investigators began asking questions never posed in 1984, the person's alibi became increasingly fragile, not because it collapsed immediately, but because each cross-reference with another detail in the new file required it to rely further on assumption and inference. The unexplained period, once considered insignificant, now lay entirely within the crime window, with no specific enough explanation to fill it. The name once overlooked for not fitting the originally accepted story, now emerged not as a definite guilty party, but as a convergence point of multiple suspicious factors: access opportunity, timing alignment, and an alibi no longer holding under close scrutiny. For the cold case team, this was a crucial transitional moment. The investigation was no longer centered on whether Eleanor Price disappeared voluntarily, but began focusing on determining a specific individual's role in the period she vanished from all reliable sight. The suspect emerging from the old file itself brought no sense of triumph, but a heavy realization: if these questions had been asked from the start, this name might not have lain dormant for so many years. But now, with the new timeline structure and identified crime window, the alibi's shakiness was no longer a side detail, but the focus of the next investigative direction, where every answer would face pressure it had never encountered in the 3 decades before. As the suspect had emerged from the very pages of the old file, and their alibi began to waver under the light of the new timeline, the cold case team entered the most sensitive phase of the investigation: confrontation. This was no longer about reading documents or reconstructing hypotheses in an office, but about returning to real people, real memories, and words that had been repeated for decades as unquestioned truth, The investigators fully understood that after so many years, memories fade, people change, and not every contradiction equals deceit. Therefore, the aim of the re-interviews was not to force confessions, but to peel away layers of accounts, compare them with what had been said in the past, and see what still held when no longer sheltered by old assumptions. Witnesses who had appeared in the 1984 file were contacted again, one by one, not to ask what more they remembered, but how they remembered. Investigators posed the same questions in different ways, at different points in the conversation, to see whether answers retained consistent structure. For most witnesses, differences merely reflected the passage of time. Times became vaguer, small details forgotten, but no directional changes. However, when it came to the previously overlooked suspect, the picture began to differ. The individual agreed to be re-interviewed, appeared cooperative, and initially repeated almost verbatim the statement given decades earlier. That very smoothness drew the investigators' attention, for memory rarely retains such sharpness after so long, unless it has been rehearsed. During the confrontation, investigators did not directly challenge the alibi, but asked the suspect to recount the day naturally, without relying on specific times. In doing so, a small detail began to shift. In the old statement, the suspect had claimed to be at a specific location for a certain period, and that period had been used to cover the crime window. This time, when recounting freely, that period was first extended, then contracted in subsequent answers. The change was not large, only a few minutes, but enough for investigators to realize the story no longer matched its earlier version. When gently asked about the discrepancy, the suspect explained that memory may have distorted over time, a reasonable, unsuspicious answer if taken alone. But when investigators placed this shift alongside contradictions already uncovered in the file, it ceased to be harmless. Simultaneously, other witnesses were re-asked about details thought long dead. One witness previously assessed as unreliable in the old file, when re-interviewed, recalled little new, but held firm on one point, where others always wavered. Eleanor pausing in the crowd and briefly interacting with a man. The witness's description of build and position was not wholly accurate, but when cross-referenced with the suspect's latest statement, a troubling coincidence emerged in the very detail the suspect had just altered. That coincidence was not enough to charge, but it created a logical link that had never existed before. Investigators continued peeling away, not by pressure, but by letting accounts collide with each other. Each time the suspect adjusted their story to fit a new question, another detail in the file became harder to explain. The alibi once considered solid, now depended on time periods so flexible, they no longer offered protection. When investigators placed the suspect's 1984 and present statements side by side, they saw consistency lay in overall structure, but key details slid in ways advantageous to the teller in each specific context. This was not evidence of poor memory, but a sign of a story adjusted to avoid a dangerous point. The chain of reasoning began closing from here. Access opportunity had been established in the crime window, the alibi no longer held under cross-referencing, and a statement once treated as an outlier, now fitted the new picture better than adjusted accounts. Each element alone might still have gaps, but layered together they formed an increasingly difficult to refute logical structure. For the cold case team, this was the moment the investigation shifted from possibility to probability. No longer was the question whether something had happened in that time gap, but who had been there, and why their story could not stand when placed under the pressure of the reconstructed truth. Lies, if any, did not reveal themselves in one big slip, but in small repeated adjustments, each aimed at covering the same gap. When the interviews ended, investigators declared no victory, but they knew that for the first time in decades, Eleanor Price's file possessed a chain of reasoning tight enough to take one step further. Not every question was answered, but for the first time, the answers given no longer stood alone, they were bound together in a structure where deceit, if it existed, had nowhere left to hide. As the chain of reasoning had closed tightly enough to no longer depend on any single detail, the cold case team moved from analysis to action. This was not a decision made in a moment of impulse, but the result of multiple internal reviews in which every piece of evidence was tested to see whether it held if separated from the story it was helping to create. The arrest warrant was not based on a confession or one decisive piece of evidence, but on the aggregate access opportunity in the crime window, an alibi no longer consistent under cross-referencing contradictions in statements across decades, and details once overlooked, now linking in a way more reasonable than any prior hypothesis. In the warrant application, everything was presented coldly and precisely, no emotion, no speculation, only what could be proven, that the suspect had been at the place and time Eleanor Price disappeared, and that their story could not be true in all the versions offered. When the warrant was approved, it marked a turning point not only legally, but psychologically for those who had pursued the case for years. After decades of silence, the return of a name from the old file to center stage as prime suspect was something no one had been certain would happen. The arrest was planned discreetly, without fanfare, for the investigation team understood this was a fragile moment where any mistake could collapse everything they had painstakingly built. The suspect was approached in a completely ordinary setting, with no indication that their present life was about to be torn apart. When officers appeared and announced the arrest, the initial reaction was not resistance but stunned shock. Bewilderment was evident not only on the suspect's face, but on those around them, who could not comprehend why a case thought forgotten since the 1980s had suddenly resurfaced with such weight. There was no chase, no dramatic declaration, only heavy silence, as handcuffs clicked shut, and another chapter of the suspect's life began. For the cold case team, this moment brought no sense of triumph, but a cautious confirmation that what they had done was no longer within the realm of hypothesis. The arrest was not the conclusion, but the official acknowledgement that Eleanor Price's disappearance was no longer treated as an administrative mystery, but as a criminal case requiring resolution before the law. In the hours that followed, news of the arrest spread, causing waves of surprise in the small circles that had once known of the case. For many, Eleanor was merely a faint name in memory, attached to a story that never had an answer. Hearing that someone had been arrested after so many years forced them to confront the possibility that what happened on that autumn evening in 1984 might have been misunderstood for a very long time. That astonishment was not sensational, but quiet, like an old door unexpectedly opening to reveal a room no one thought still held anything inside. During transfer, the suspect made no public statement, and the investigation team maintained silence, allowing legal procedures to proceed in order. Any media questions, if raised, were answered with brief confirmations of the arrest without detail. For those working the case, this restraint was necessary. They knew any hasty statement could be used to challenge the legality of the entire process. When the suspect was brought into the interview room as a formally detained person, the atmosphere differed markedly from previous voluntary interviews. No longer was it willing cooperation, but direct confrontation between the story the suspect had told for years and the rebuilt evidential structure designed to challenge it. Yet even in this moment, the investigation team remained cautious. They knew an arrest after decades did not itself guarantee conviction, and the road ahead remained long. Whatever the final outcome, the arrest had shattered the prolonged stasis of the file, forcing it to move once more within the justice system. Eleanor Price's disappearance, once shelved and fallen silent, was no longer a question suspended in archives. It had entered a new phase where every assumption would face public scrutiny, and where the astonishment of those around reflected a simple yet heavy truth: the past, no matter how deeply buried, can still return, and when it does, it asks no one's permission. When the case came to trial, the greatest challenge from the outset lay not in the suspect's identity or the file's complexity, but in an unchangeable fact: this was a nobody case. After more than 3 decades, Eleanor Price had still never been found, and prosecuting someone for a crime related to her disappearance required convincing the jury that what happened was not merely possible, but the only reasonable conclusion from the evidence. The prosecution knew they could not rely on emotion or speculation, for in a case like this, any logical gap would be ruthlessly exploited by the defense. The prosecution strategy was therefore built around a single axis: the new timeline, systematically reconstructed, and the suspect's behavior when placed within it. Rather than trying to retell the entire story from scratch, the prosecution focused on guiding the jury step by step through the process the cold case team had followed, emphasizing that this was not a novel hypothesis, but the result of stripping away old assumptions and cross-referencing what had existed in the file for years. The core of the argument was not how Eleanor died, but why her disappearance could not be explained by any harmless scenario when the crime window and the suspect's access opportunity were considered. In court, the timeline was presented not as a rigid sequence of clock times, but as a logical structure, each statement placed according to its reliability. The prosecution pointed out that the original 1984 timeline had inadvertently erased a critical gap, and that very gap was where every question belonged. When the crime window was clearly explained, the jury was invited to consider who alone was present in the area, had opportunity to approach Eleanor, and could not provide a consistent explanation for their presence in that period. The defense, as expected, focused on the inherent weaknesses of a no-body case. They stressed there was no direct evidence Eleanor was dead, no eyewitness to a criminal act, and that the entire prosecution case rested on inference from incomplete pieces. Counsel questioned the reliability of witness memory after decades, the possibility of error in reconstructing the timeline, and whether contradictions in statements truly pointed to guilt or merely reflected human memory's imperfection. Legal argument revolved around the timeline, each side attempting to persuade the jury that the same data could lead to different conclusions. The prosecution countered by stressing they were not asking the jury to believe any single detail, but to consider the whole picture. They emphasized that while each contradiction alone might be innocently explained, the totality of contradictions, converging on one person in one time period, could no longer be regarded as coincidence. The suspect's behavior was analyzed not only on the evening Eleanor disappeared, but in how they had maintained their story across decades, adjusting details as needed to protect a gap now clearly identified. The prosecution's strategy peaked when a key piece of evidence was presented, not traditional physical evidence, but the combination of a once-overlooked related item and how it fitted the new timeline. The prosecution explained that this item, seriously examined for the first time in years, proved nothing directly yet served as a logical anchor, showing Eleanor had not acted in a manner consistent with voluntary disappearance in that period. When placed in the crime window alongside cross-reference statements and the crumbling alibi, it became the final piece needed to complete the chain of reasoning. The defense attempted to diminish this evidence, calling it speculative and stressing it proved no specific criminal act. But the prosecution did not treat it as standalone proof, using it as part of the overall structure, where each piece reinforced the others. Courtroom argument was neither loud nor dramatic in the style of cases with confessions or DNA, but a slow battle of intellect, where each side sought dominance through logic and consistency. For the jury, the challenge was not believing a shocking narrative, but accepting that in a no-body case, truth does not appear as a clear moment, but as a conclusion built by excluding every other reasonable possibility. As the trial neared its end, no one in the courtroom could be certain of the outcome. The prosecution had presented a tight story, yet they knew that if even one juror remained unconvinced about the timeline or the suspect's behavior, the entire case could collapse. The defense, despite exploiting every weakness, had to face the reality that the reasonable at the time decisions of 1984 had now been convincingly dismantled. In that tense atmosphere, Eleanor Price's no-body case stood at a critical threshold, where the question was no longer whether truth existed, but whether the justice system was prepared to recognize a truth constructed from logic, consistency, and gaps that could not be explained in any other way. As the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence, no longer the tension of legal argument, but the feeling of awaiting a decision that would close or open an entirely new chapter for a case that had stretched over more than 3 decades. For the prosecution, this was the moment when every effort to reconstruct the timeline, strip away old assumptions, and present a logical story had to stand on its own without further explanation or additional argument. For the defense, it was the time to hope that the unavoidable gaps of a nobody case would be enough to create reasonable doubt in the mind of at least one juror. In the meantime, Eleanor Price, the person at the center of all these arguments, still existed only through the pages of the file, the statements, and the reconstructed time periods, without physical presence to affirm or refute anything. When the jury returned, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed markedly. Every gaze turned towards them, for everyone understood that the impending decision concerned not only the fate of the suspect, but also how the justice system viewed a long-term disappearance that had never been resolved. The verdict was read out slowly, word by word, and when the final words rang out, it became clear that the court had accepted the prosecution's core argument. Eleanor Price's disappearance could not be explained by any harmless scenario, and the circumstantial evidence, when considered as a whole, was sufficient to surpass the threshold of reasonable doubt. The court's decision was not based on determining exactly what had happened in the crime window, but on establishing that a criminal act had led to Eleanor's permanent disappearance. This was a verdict clear in legal terms, but also carrying a caution expressed in its wording. The court did not declare that every detail of the autumn evening in 1984 had been reconstructed, but affirmed that the presented evidence showed Eleanor had not disappeared voluntarily, and that her prolonged absence was the result of a criminal act. The disappearance was thus officially determined to be a crime. For the prosecution, this was confirmation that the strategy focused on the timeline and behavior had convinced the jury that logic could substitute for the absence of a body. For the defense, the verdict was a heavy defeat, but also proof that the court was prepared to accept that in some cases, legal truth need not come with traditional physical evidence. As the judge explained the decision, he emphasized that this was not a case decided on emotion or speculation, but on the systematic exclusion of other reasonable possibilities. Assumptions once considered reasonable in 1984 had been re-examined in the light of accumulated contradictions and errors, and when they were eliminated, what remained was no longer an administrative mystery, but a chain of events that could only be understood as a crime. This verdict did not provide complete answers to every question. It did not indicate where Eleanor had been taken, or what had happened to her after the moment she vanished from witnesses' sight, but legally, it put an end to the ambiguity that had enveloped the case for decades. Eleanor Price was no longer recorded as a person missing for unknown reasons, but as the victim of a criminal act. This shift carried profound meaning, for it changed how the case would be remembered and handled in judicial history. In the courtroom, reactions to the verdict were not loud. There were no cheers, no outburst of emotion. Those following the case, from the cold case investigators to those who had once read about Eleanor in old news reports, received the decision with a feeling mixed between relief and heaviness. Relief because after so many years, the silence had finally been broken by an official conclusion. Heaviness, because that conclusion affirmed the worst had happened, even though no one could say exactly how. The verdict also sent a broader message, extending beyond this case. It showed that long-term disappearances, once considered unsolvable due to lack of physical evidence, could still be brought to light if old assumptions were challenged and the pieces placed in their proper positions. The court, by accepting a no-body case, had recognized the value of reconstructing truth through logic and consistency, rather than waiting for perfect evidence that might never appear. As the trial ended, Eleanor Price, though still unfound, had been granted a measure of justice in the way the system could provide. Her disappearance was no longer an open question forgotten in archives, but a determined case, a crime that had been named. The verdict did not bring Eleanor back, but it ended years of denial and mistaken assumptions, affirming that her disappearance was not a vague twist of fate, but the result of human action, and that however late, the justice system could still stand and call that truth by its proper name. As the verdict had been delivered, and Eleanor Price's disappearance officially determined to be a crime, an unavoidable question began to be asked, not in the courtroom but in the very pages of the file, and in the minds of those who had touched this case over 40 years, what had been missed in all that time. The reflection was not to seek an individual to blame, but to understand why the truth had taken decades to be properly named. The initial mistakes, when placed in the context of 1984, did not appear as reckless or careless decisions, but as reasonable choices based on the information and standards of the time. But that very reasonableness, when accumulated and unchallenged, had created an investigative trajectory hard to reverse. The greatest mistake lay not in a specific action, but in a foundational assumption that Eleanor's absence could be explained without crime. This assumption was never written as a conclusion, but it permeated every decision, from constructing the timeline, evaluating statements, to resource allocation. When an assumption is deemed reasonable, details not fitting it are automatically treated as secondary, and that is precisely what happened. Contradictory statements were not cross-referenced, not because they were forgotten, but because doing so might collapse the temporary structure the investigation relied on to continue. Another mistake, only clear in retrospect, was how time was flattened in the file. Choosing a standard time point to build the timeline brought short-term order, but it also erased the ability to see the crime window, where Eleanor was not reliably seen. When time was turned into fixed points rather than uncertain bands, critical gaps vanished from view. Along with that was the failure to fully preserve initial notes, handwritten details, unsmoothed wording. No one in 1984 could know that 30 or 40 years later, the small differences between handwritten and typed versions would become keys to identifying contradictions. Transferring information in ways fitting the processes of the time had inadvertently lost the depth needed for later self-verification. Another factor contributing to the truth's delay was the evolution of the system itself. The original investigation occurred in an era when adult disappearances were often handled with a different level of caution than today, especially without clear signs of violence. The concept of cold cases as a specialized field was undeveloped, and returning to challenge past implicit conclusions was not standard practice. Only when the cold case team took the file with a clear mandate to reread everything from scratch, without respecting old assumptions, did the contradictions become properly visible. The truth did not arrive late because it was completely hidden, but because it was fragmented and misplaced, each piece lying dormant in the file, without anyone reassembling them differently. The role of human factors in this delay must also be acknowledged. The 1984 investigators lacked neither effort nor good intent, but they worked under pressures of time, resources, and a city always producing new cases demanding attention. When a disappearance yielded no strong leads, it gradually moved from the center, and prolonged silence created the sense that perhaps there was nothing left to find. Time, rather than revealing the truth, blurred memories and reinforced accepted assumptions. Only when time was reset, when the file was read as a story never properly told, did the overlooked emerge. Why did the truth arrive late? Because it required a rare combination: enough distance to challenge what was once reasonable, enough patience to reread every page without seeking confirmation of existing conclusions, and enough institutional courage to admit an old file might have gone wrong. Eleanor Price's case shows that truth in long-term disappearances is not necessarily out of reach, but often lies in details already recorded, awaiting a different perspective. Its late arrival does not diminish its value, but it poses an uncomfortable question for the system: how many other files lie dormant, not for lack of information, but for lack of a moment when old assumptions are allowed to collapse? As all legal procedures concluded, and Eleanor Price's case was officially recorded in the justice system as a determined crime, her file entered the final state it had awaited for 40 years, being called by its proper name. No longer a vague disappearance suspended among assumptions, no longer a set of documents lying dormant in storage, labeled unsolved. Eleanor's story now had a clear place in the city's legal history. Closing the file was not a matter of triumph, but of completion, a recognition that what had happened was no longer denied or blurred by the convenience of old assumptions. A disappearance had been determined to be a crime, and though it was impossible to reconstruct every detail of the autumn evening in 1984, the system had achieved the most important thing, acknowledging that Eleanor Price did not vanish due to personal choice or the randomness of fate, but because of the actions of another person. Meanwhile, London continued to move, as it always had, not pausing for any individual tragedy. The streets around Fenchurch Street, where Eleanor had once left her office during rush hour, had now changed appearance, with new buildings, new crowds, and a pace of life faster than ever. For most of the city, Eleanor's story was just a news item, a case mentioned briefly, then quickly replaced by other events. But London's continued operation did not diminish the meaning of the file's closure. On the contrary, it underscored a stark reality: the city does not wait for justice to advance, and precisely because of that, the eventual delivery of justice, however late, becomes all the more necessary. The void Eleanor had left over 4 decades was no longer nameless. Previously, it was a vague emptiness, filled with speculation, assumptions, and silence. Now that void was placed in a clear framework. It was the consequence of a crime. Calling it by its proper name did not bring Eleanor back, but it restored meaning to her absence, an acknowledgement that the years of waiting were not meaningless. For those who had worked on the file, closure was not the end of memory, but the release of a prolonged responsibility. They understood that not every question had been answered, but also knew that the legal truth achieved was the highest limit the system could reach in this case. Eleanor Price's case became a quiet reminder of what can be missed when assumptions replace questioning, and of the ability of truth to rise even after being buried by time. As the file was closed, Eleanor was no longer a name on a list of missing persons, but a person whose story had been heard and placed in its rightful position. London continued to move, but somewhere in that ceaseless flow, Eleanor Price's story had left a mark no longer faint, a mark affirming that even in a vast and indifferent city, unexplained voids can ultimately be called by their proper name, and that prolonged silence, though it may conceal truth for years, is not necessarily where it will remain forever. The story of Eleanor Price is not merely a cold case solved after 40 years, but a mirror reflecting many very real aspects of life in the United Kingdom today. In a modern society where London continues to move quickly, people still easily believe that everything is fine when there are no clear signs of violence, just as the assumption that Eleanor might have left voluntarily silently dominated the entire 1984 investigation. The first lesson lies in that very assumption. In modern life, especially in Britain's major cities, prolonged silence from a person should not be normalized. The fact that Eleanor did not make contact, left no signs of preparation, yet was still placed in the not serious enough category, shows how we sometimes allow administrative convenience and societal habits to obscure unusual signs. The second lesson comes from how the file flattened time, when a reasonable time point was chosen, and other details bent to fit it. In everyday life, this reminds us that truth is rarely as neat as we wish. Off-standard details, mismatched stories are often where we need to listen most, even if they cause discomfort or disrupt a sense of security. Finally, the way the Metropolitan Police cold case team reread every report, cross-referenced statements, and recontextualized a once overlooked related item, sends a very British message about responsibility and patience. Justice does not always come quickly, but it demands persistence, humility, and willingness to admit that decisions reasonable at the time might have been wrong. In life in the United Kingdom today, the lesson from Eleanor Price is to value attention to those around us, not to hastily dismiss the unusual just because it is inconvenient, and to believe that asking the right questions, even late, can still change how a void is named. If you believe stories like Eleanor Price deserve to be heard to the end, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue shining a light on files thought to have fallen into silence. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where another void will be called by its proper name.